Today, we're heading to Madagascar. And this place is less a country and more an evolutionary laboratory. It's just packed with some of the world's most incredible plants, but what we're really focusing on are its spectacular orchids. Okay, so get this. This one number, it pretty much sets the stage for everything we're about to talk about. 90%. That's right. Madagascar has over 900 different kinds of orchids, and a staggering 90% of them are endemic. That means you can't find them anywhere else on the entire planet, just there. So you gotta ask, right? How? How did this one isolated island become the canvas for so many of nature's masterpieces? It's an amazing question, and we're gonna try and unpack it. All right, first things first. To even begin to understand these orchids, you have to understand Madagascar itself. People call it the eighth continent for a reason. It's been isolated for over 80 million years, and that incredible amount of time is what allowed these amazing flowers to evolve. And here's a really key point. When you think of evolution on islands, you might picture someplace like the Galapagos, right, where things happened really fast, kind of like an explosion of new species. But Madagascar? That's a whole different story. This was a slow burn, a steady, gradual masterpiece of adaptation, playing out over geological time. So, think about the challenge. How on earth does a plant family manage to conquer an entire island that has everything from steamy, dripping rainforests to bone-dry deserts? Well, they needed a few tricks up their sleeve, a special evolutionary toolkit, if you will. And probably the most important tool in that kit has this really long name, crassulacean acid metabolism. Let's just call it CAM. You might have heard of it before. It's what lets plants like cacti and pineapples survive in the desert. But for one group of orchids in Madagascar, this physiological hack was more than just a survival trick. It was like an evolutionary gateway. It let them absolutely dominate the island. So here's how it works, and it's pretty brilliant. Most plants have to breathe during the day to get CO2, right? But that's when the sun is out, so they lose a ton of water. Well, these Bulbophyllum orchids figured out a way to do their breathing at night when it's cool and humid. It sounds simple, but that one little switch was an absolute game changer. Suddenly, they could move into all these brighter, drier places their ancestors could never have survived. And you can see the results of that game changer right here. Look at this. Back in the mid-Miocene, their ancestors were stuck in the rainforest. But then, boom, around 7 million years ago, one group evolves CAM photosynthesis. And look what happens next. That single adaptation unlocked the entire island for them. They spread into monsoon forests, into the highlands, and eventually diversified into the hundreds of unique species we see today. Okay, so adapting to the climate is one thing. That's a huge piece of the puzzle. But it's only half the battle. To really make it, you have to reproduce. And for orchids, that means solving another puzzle, finding the perfect partner. It's all about forming these super specific, intimate partnerships. Think of it like an evolutionary handshake. And you can't talk about orchid partnerships without telling this story. It's the most famous one of all. Back in 1862, Charles Darwin gets a look at this orchid, the Star of Bethlehem orchid, and he's just baffled. It has this ridiculously long nectar tube, and he makes this incredibly bold prediction. He says, look, I don't see how this thing gets fertilized unless there's a moth out there with a tongue long enough to reach the nectar. And when we say long, just how long are we talking? 45 centimeters. That is almost half a meter. I mean, think about that. It's an absolutely mind-boggling length. You'd need a pretty special pollinator to make that work. Now, Darwin never got to see if he was right, but decades later, guess what? Scientists found it, the hawk moth, and they even named it Predicta, the predicted one. It's just the perfect, most textbook example of coevolution, where two species are completely locked together in this dance for survival. But, not all of these handshakes are so dramatic and visible. Some of the most important ones happen completely out of sight, underground. It's a partnership with something called mycorrhizal fungi. See, for orchids trying to grow in really poor soil, these fungi are lifesavers. They're like a personal nutrient delivery service. The fungus breaks down stuff in the soil that the orchid can't, and then feeds those nutrients directly to the plant. It's especially crucial when the orchid is just a tiny little seed trying to get started. So this constant drive to survive and find a partner has pushed these orchids to become, well, masters of extreme living. They've adapted to some of the most specialized, most challenging little corners of the island you can possibly imagine. Just take a look at the sheer diversity here. You've got the constant dripping humidity of a rainforest.
No problem. What about the baking hot surface of a granite rock? Yep, there's an orchid for that. How about surviving a drought that lasts for 9 months in the spiny forest? You bet. For pretty much every extreme environment on this island, some orchid has figured out how to call it home.
So how in the world do they survive that spiny desert? Well, they do something absolutely radical. They just get rid of their leaves completely. Instead, their roots turn green, they get packed with chlorophyll, and the roots themselves take over the entire job of making food. I mean, they're basically breathing and eating through their roots. It's just a brilliant, brilliant way to save every single last drop of water. And this specialization can get so specific. It's incredible. Take this one, the pink orchid. Its entire existence, its whole life, is tied to one single host plant, the screw palm. It cannot live anywhere else. Now that's the absolute peak of adaptation, right? But it's also a huge vulnerability. And that vulnerability brings us to the final part of our story, the final and honestly the most daunting challenge these orchids have ever faced. Because after millions of years of overcoming every natural hurdle thrown at them, they now face a crisis that is entirely human-made, a crisis that threatens to just erase their entire evolutionary story. And the numbers here are just stark. Remember that 90% figure from the beginning? Well, here it is again. 90% of Madagascar's original forests are gone. That tiny 10% sliver left, that's it. That's the last refuge, not just for these orchids, but for thousands of other species that you can't find anywhere else. And the really crucial thing to understand is how all these threats are connected. Slash and burn agriculture, it doesn't just destroy the trees the orchids live on. It chops the forest up into little pieces. And that means our hawk moth might never be able to find its partner orchid. So the handshake is broken. Then you add the pressure from illegal collectors poaching the rarest species, and you have a perfect storm. It's a recipe for extinction. Now there is some hope. It's not all doom and gloom. Conservationists on the ground are fighting so hard to protect what's left, setting up national parks. And kind of like an insurance policy, scientists are creating genetic backups in labs and botanical gardens all over the world. They're trying to safeguard this incredible diversity, just in case. Which really leaves us with one last, pretty sobering question. These orchids, they're survivors. They made it through ice ages, mega droughts, you name it. But after this 80 million year journey of brilliant, beautiful evolution, is this final human-driven challenge going to be the one that they just can't overcome? That's what's really at stake right now on the 8th continent.